Okay, here we have the story Grandma Bell's Basement, which is going to be a scary little story. In it, we're going to be looking for elements of horror. We've done a lot of scary stories, but we haven't done ones that really use horror to kind of build the story and create a creepy atmosphere. So in this one, we want to pay attention to how the author uses imagery or the description that appeals to the five senses to describe the horrors he's seeing. And obviously, when you have a horror story, a lot of it is going to be visual, so we want to keep track of the visual ones. Also, to open this one up, one of the questions I'd like you guys to think about is if you've ever been in a situation where you've been left with a relative or a friend of the family or somebody you didn't know very well, so it was kind of awkward. I always tell the story that when I was younger, my mother dropped me off at my great-grandmother's house, she was an older Italian woman, kind of had a bit of an accent and kind of eccentric and old. Very, very, very old. And when I went to stay with her, it was incredibly awkward. She actually at one point asked me if I was hungry. I said yes, and she decided that she would break out some old pepperoni out of her refrigerator. It was the type of stuff that came in the big sticks like sausages. Well, as she started cutting the pepperoni, I noticed that it was leaking this orange fluid because the pepperoni was quite obviously bad and probably rancid. So as a little kid, I was trying to figure out if I was going to have to actually eat this rancid, rotten pepperoni, or if I was going to be able to tell my poor great-grandmother that, I can't eat that, Grandma, that stuff is nasty, when luckily my mom came home and rescued me, and we ended up getting McDonald's. So anyway, when I start the story, think about situations where you've been with a relative that you're not very comfortable with because it's going to make this more awkward. Now, some words to think about as we go through. First off, for vocabulary, we have bloated, which is over full or fat. Somebody that's described as bloated, like somebody that eats a lot of food, they might say, I feel bloated. That would be what it means. A migrant, that's going to be important because in this story, it's going to talk about the fact that they have a farm and they use migrant workers. Migrant workers are usually people that move from place to place, usually seasonally. So, for example, if there's a certain crop that needs to be picked a certain season, the migrant workers would go to that state or that place. They would work for a while, and then they would leave when the winter came and go somewhere else, usually down south where it's warmer. Eclipsing, it's like think of an eclipse of the sun. It means covering up or blocking. Picturesque, you guys should know this one by now because it's popped up a few times in the stories we've done. That means beautiful like a photograph. Apprehension is the feeling of unease or worry. So if you're feeling apprehensive about something, you're worried about doing it. Escalating, going up rapidly or increasing. Intervals with a pause or a break. Gnarled, which is rough or twisted with age. So think of an old tree that's gnarled and crooked and twisted. And visage, which is a person's face, a fancy word for it. So, all right, now that we've gotten those words out of the way, let's get into the story. Now, as we go through the questions on it, keep in mind the questions on this one are more geared toward understanding what's happening in the story, because at the end, we're going to want to try to put some clues together and figure out exactly why this young man is in the situation he's in and what is going on. And there are some clues there. And at the end of it, I will discuss it a bit. So, moving on to the story, Grandma Bell's Basement. There's something sinister going on at Grandma Bell's farm, and poor Toby is about to discover its horrible secrets. Now, just to give you guys a heads up, I'm sitting in a room full of dogs. They tend to burp, fart, and make noises, so if you hear them in the background, it's not me, it's the dogs. Wincing as his damp thighs stuck to the vinyl seat, Toby shifted. So far, the hour-long ride into the country had proved an exercise in torture. A bloated August sun sat low in the sky, beating down on the small sedan as it wound through the parched countryside. The car's air conditioner had quit the year before, and nothing had been done to fix it. As he peeled his t-shirt away from his chest like a blistered layer of skin, he cursed Dad's cheapness. Now, boy, you make sure that you behave for your grandma, because let me tell you, she's a tough old bird, and she won't hesitate to smack you if you get out of line. As he watched the tall stalks of corn pass by the car window in a green-brown smudge, he wondered why someone would choose to live out in this farm country. Grandpa Joe had passed away before Toby was even born, and he had left poor old Grandma Bell the farm, along with its 100-acre estate. For the last decade, she had managed to keep the small farm going, selling enough livestock and corn to pay the taxes and the bills. Toby wasn't sure how the 70-year-old woman was able to care for the animals, let alone harvest and plant the fields on her own. He had once heard his father say that she hired migrant workers to help out, but Toby hadn't a clue as to what they were. Yes, Toby had heard tales of Grandma Bell for many years, but he had never spent any time alone with her. If he were fortunate, he would only see her once a year, usually at Thanksgiving, when she made the lengthy drive down from the farm in her old green pickup truck. Not that he minded. The old woman made him uncomfortable. They had told him that Grandma Bell had been a last resort, that they had only considered her after all of the other babysitters fell through. but Toby knew better. He understood that this afternoon excursion with Grandma Belle was little more than a thinly veiled punishment. For what? He couldn't be certain. Outside the car, a dark cloud cover moved in, eclipsing the sun's rays and washing the landscape in thick shadow. Another thunderstorm approached. A giant ceiling of dark cloud cover crept above the cornfields like a sinister void. Spaced at regular intervals throughout the field, their blackened, sun-baked tips protruding just above the tops of the stalks, loomed a number of posts. There had to be dozens of them, he surmised as he made a quick count. Maybe he would ask Grandma about them later. "Here we are," Father announced as he turned down the dirt driveway. Ahead sat the old Hutchins farmhouse. The ancient home stood proud and picturesque against the August sky. To the left of the home grew a sturdy old oak, its gnarled limbs clawed at the rippled roof. From one of the lower boughs hung a tire swing that had probably been attached in his father's youth. Obscured by the house, the old red barn stood, its ancient frame sagging. Okay, so let's pause here for a minute and go through a couple of the questions in the margins. First off, who are the main characters and what details are we given about each? We've only gotten a few so far. Obviously, Toby is going to be our protagonist or main character. So let's get some information down with Toby. Now, as far as Toby's age, the fact that he needs a babysitter points to the fact that he's a bit younger. I'm guessing probably 10 to 12 or so. It's important once we get into the story to recognize that he's obviously not a teenager. Some people suspect that he's a little older than he is. Now, the other thing we should be looking at here is setting. They've given us plenty of details for setting. I want you guys to get some of those down. Remember, we're talking about not only the time of year it is, and the weather, for example, would be a good one. And with this story, I want you guys to pay careful attention to what is going on with the weather. So as we start out, it's hot, and now we have a storm or cloud covers in the distance. I want you guys to pay attention to each time the weather is mentioned, particularly I have a hard time saying that one, the storm clouds are coming in. As things get more scary in the story, I want you guys to tell me what's going on with the weather, because there is a correlation, there is a connection between the two of them as we go through the story. So take a moment now and fill in the details for this, and when you're ready, unpause this, and we will go on to the next part of the story. Grandma Belle waved from the front porch. She wore her normal attire, black work boots, thick black cotton house dress, all complemented by a worn apron that, in its day, used to be white but was now more of a gentle shade of gray. Toby was always amazed at her thinness, a skeleton with just enough flesh and muscle to keep her upright. However, her uncanny height made her an impressive figure nonetheless. "She looks like a scarecrow," Toby thought aloud, not realizing that he had given his thoughts substance. "What was that?" Mother asked as she twisted her neck to face him. "Watch your mouth," Father warned. "Sorry, Dad." Although they were still a dozen or so yards away, he felt as if she was staring right at him. He shifted nervously in his seat. Father pulled the car up to the turnaround and put it into park. "Listen, Toby, we're running a little late, and I really don't have any extra time to chat with your grandmother. Why don't I just let you out here, and you can tell her I'll talk to her when we get back?" "But, Dad," he whined in protest. "No buts. Now go." Toby flung the door open and stepped out into the humid August afternoon. "We'll see you in a few hours," Mother cooed lovingly. No sooner had Toby slammed the door shut on the old Nova when Father gave it the gas and peeled away. Forthwith, all that was left to mark his parents' departure was a cloud of dust and a tiny peppering of rust on the ground where the car had been. "Well, are you going to just stand there all day, or are you going to come over and see your grandma?" Luckily, she couldn't see him roll his eyes as he turned and grudgingly moved forward. "Hi, Grandma Belle." "Look at you, Sprout," she croaked as she seized his shoulders. For a feeble old woman, her grip was powerful. "I'd say that you shot up another 2 inches. He didn't answer, only smiled as he tried to fortify his nostrils against her musty odor. It was a bitter combination of mold and fresh-cut grass. "Well, let's not stand out here all day. It'll be getting dark soon and the skeeters will be out. They've been known to drain a man dry in these parts." She laid a bony arm on his shoulder. It was as weightless as dry wood. Tony tried not to cringe as he allowed Grandma Belle to lead him to the rickety steps through the front door. Her bare arm rested across his neck, and he had to fight the urge to shrug it off. Strangely, despite the heat, her dry flesh was cool. "We're going to have ourselves a great old time today," she said as she ushered him into the darkened house. They moved into the kitchen. "I'll fix us some fresh iced tea." It was unlike any kitchen he had ever been in, as most of the amenities he associated with the room were nowhere to be found. Absent were the microwave, the toaster oven, the Mr. Coffee, and the glass-top range. The refrigerator, an ancient ivory model with a locking door and more rounded edges than corners, didn't even sport an ice maker. Apparently, cleaning wasn't one of Grandma Bell's favorite pastimes. It was conceivable that no mop or sponge had ever touched the room. A yellow layer of grime muted every color in the kitchen. In each corner, braids of spiderwebs hung like fine lace. Her dishes from that morning, as well as some from a few other meals, sat stacked in teetering piles in and around the large basin-like sink. "Sorry about the mess," Grandma Bell apologized as she pulled out one of the chairs from the table. "I hadn't gotten around to cleaning here yet today." "Looks to me like you haven't gotten around to cleaning this year," Toby thought as he flicked a dried piece of corn from the chair before taking a seat. Placing 2 large glasses of iced tea on the table, Grandma took the seat across from him. "So how's school going? You getting good grades?" Grandma sipped her own drink. "We didn't start school yet," he snapped. He didn't look at her as he spoke, but instead he studied the framed black and white photograph hanging just above the table. The picture was of a man, probably in his 30s, standing on the porch of the farmhouse. It was easy to recognize the man's impressive height and sturdy build. The shirt sleeves of his button-down flannel had been rolled up, revealing his heavily muscled forearms. Beneath the thick, dark hair was a small tattoo. Toby couldn't be certain, but it looked to be some type of 5-pointed star. "That was your grandpa," Grandma said, and her old bloodshot eyes glistened with sentimentality. "He was the strongest man in 3 counties, he was. It was a goddamn shame what happened to him. By the end, I could barely stand to look at him, all withered up and sickly. He looked just like a goddamn—" She stopped, as if she couldn't bear to finish the sentence. Toby frowned. "Enough of all that. Here I am making you all glum." She rubbed her skeletal hands together to emphasize that she was getting down to business. They scratched like 2 pieces of sandpaper. "So what do you want to do today?" Toby shrugged. "I suppose that you kids nowadays like watching the television, is that right?" Anything that didn't involve more awkward attempts at conversation sounded okay to Toby. "Yeah, TV sounds good," he managed. "Well, you just follow me then." With a twirl of her thick dress, the old lady spun and headed toward the living room. She led Tony past stacks of magazines and worn copies of the Reader's Digest and to a small TV in the corner. "I ain't used this in a long time. Let me just make sure that it's all set." Blowing on the screen, she sent a puff of thick dust into the air. She pulled the tarnished knob. Toby watched as the circular screen buzzed, popped, and fizzled to life, and a monochrome image materialized on the slate-gray tube. It was a close-up of a man. His colorless mouth chattered, but no words came out. "Let me turn the sound up," Grandma said. The man on the television screen was a preacher, and he warned those who would ignore the word of God. "Now, I don't know what I got for channels, so you'll have to play with it. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me." Relaxing some as she left, Toby turned the channel knob on the old set. Only 2 channels came in. Quickly deciding that neither of the programs would soothe his boredom, he flicked the set off and stared at his own reflection. There had to be something fun that he could do that wouldn't involve spending time with Grandma Bell. Looking out the grime-caked window, Toby had an idea. He raced to the kitchen. All right, so let's pause a moment and answer some of these questions in the side. Again, I'll try to give you a little clues, but it's up to you guys to do it. What you want to do is include them in a Google Doc, and those will be in the instructions. So first one, how does weather play a part in the story? What does it represent? You're not going to know what it represents yet because we've only done a short part of the story, but I want you to pay careful attention to the rain clouds that are forming. And then every time they mention those clouds, I want you to mention what's going on in the story mood-wise, and then what's going on as far as the weather. So, for example, right now, things are looking pretty normal, except he's just having awkward interactions with his grandma. As things start to get weirder, what happens to the weather? Now, similes or metaphors, those are things, similes, let's look for similes, and those are comparisons made with the words like or as. So, for example, what happens, hint, hint, when Grandma Bell rubs her 2 hands together? What sound does it make? At one point, he describes her as looking like something. What is it? So let's get a couple of those down. Again, these might be a little more difficult because we haven't spent as much time on the similes this year, but try to get those down so that you have at least 2 of them in there. And what I will do is when I'm reading, moving ahead, I will spend a bit more time emphasizing when there is a simile or metaphor. Now, conflict of the story. Right now, we don't have a conflict now, but we will later on, and I will mention when we get to that point that we can probably fill in the conflict. And then rising action, examples of imagery. What are some examples of imagery we have in the story? Well, a lot of them right now involve the farmhouse and describing Grandma Bell, the way she's described. Even the kitchen, the way they describe the kitchen, there is some good imagery there. So pick a spot and use a quote from the story with examples of where the author is really describing something. So this is a story that some would refer to as a slow burn, meaning it takes a while to get going before things start getting weird and creepy. But what do you think about the setup so far? Give me in that margin on page 95, what do you think is happening so far? What do you think might happen in the story? And how are you enjoying the story so far? So one of the things we want to look at is obviously Toby is so eager to get away from his grandmother and her house because it's awkward and because, quite frankly, there's nothing to do. I don't know if you guys caught it, but the TV set is black and white, and it's the old models that kind of have the rounder screen. You guys are all probably used to the square flat screens now, or rectangular and flat screens. So nothing in the house screams something that would be fun to a 10, 12-year-old boy. So what do you think his plan is? What is he going to ask Grandma Bell? And I will say from this point on, the story is going to heat up quite a bit. All right, so now that we've discussed the story a little bit more, we're going to get into the meat of it. So this would be the exposition. When we talk about the opening of the story where the author kind of lays out everything we need to know to enjoy the story, we're getting all the information here. We're getting the fact that he hasn't been to Grandma Bell's house in a long time. He actually never been ever. He only sees her once a year. They also fill in some background information that we're going to want to keep an eye on, which is about Grandpa Bell. Grandpa Bell apparently was a big, strong farmer guy. That picture in the kitchen was of Grandpa Bell. And he ended up getting sick and dying. So think about what type of illness could have done that to somebody that causes them to wither away till he looked like, as Grandma Bell put it, a scarecrow. Or at least that's what she was going to start to say. So Grandpa Bell is apparently dead. Grandma Bell is obviously taking care of the farm herself. And they're not sure how she does it because taking care of a farm is a very difficult task. Toby's father thinks it's because of migrant workers, which means she has people that come in during the summer, help her, and then move off in the fall after the harvest is done. So let's pay a little bit of attention to that as we go forward. So as we've left it, he has an idea. He wants to ask Grandma Bell if he could do something. Let's see what it is. Hey, Grandma Bell, can I go outside to look around? He asked. Grandma Bell sat down the dish she had been scrubbing and turned to face him. Oh, I don't know. It's looking kind of dark out there. I reckon the sky is going to open up any minute. Please, I'd really like to see the farm, check out the animals. Grandma Bell's eyes locked on his as she considered the idea. Well, I suppose it would be all right. I have some things I have to do anyway. But you come back in here the minute you see any raindrops. And don't go futzing around with the cows. They don't like strangers. Toby had already reached the door. Don't go in the cornfields, 'cause you'll get lost. He turned the knob and spilled outside. And stay away from the basement. Leaping from the top step to the soft earth, Toby was unable to suppress a smile. He was free. Plucking a piece of timothy from just beyond the fence, he slipped it between his lips as he skipped toward the barn. Above, the sky was a deep purple as thunderclouds threatened to relieve themselves violently on the countryside. The air was thick and electric, and a strong breeze had risen from the north. As it whipped through the treetops, it dislodged some leaves, sprinkling them on the ground like confetti. There was a worn dirt path, more a furrow really, carved by Grandma Bell's footsteps. It led from the front of the house to the barn. Toby followed it. Clutching the large handle on the barn door, Toby dragged it open. The barn exhaled, and its breath smelt of fresh-cut hay and cow manure. The giant structure offered few windows and no electricity, and Toby had to strain his eyes to see. Ahead, just beyond a wall of gloom, a cow mooed. "How you doing, girl?" Toby asked as he crept inside. Parked immediately behind the huge sliding door was Grandma Bell's tractor, and Toby nearly walked into one of its shoulder-high back tires. To the left of the tractor, a cow stuck her head out above the stall door as she chewed her cud. Toby scratched her nose and ventured deeper into the barn. As he walked inside, Toby felt his insides slowly knotting in apprehension, and he cursed his cowardice. It wasn't as if there were anything to fear. After all, it was just an old barn with a couple of cows, a tractor, and some hay. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He considered returning to the farmhouse, but the thought of spending any more time with Grandma Bell was enough to deter him. No, he'd rather brave the horrors of his imagination than suffer through another moment with Grandma. Finally, Toby's eyes adjusted to the dark and he was able to see his way. The barn was enormous. At one time, its stalls were home to 36 dairy cows. Now, all but 6 of the compartments were vacant, having sat unoccupied for the better part of 4 decades. High above the straw-covered floor sat the hayloft. Toby could see the bales of hay stacked like fuzzy bricks. An impossibly tall wooden ladder at the back of the barn led up to the loft. If he had some company, he might have tried climbing it. Toby was about to leave when he noticed something peculiar at the far end of the barn. Curious, he plunged deeper into the oppressive darkness. What is that? He wondered aloud as he neared the morbid display. Hanging from a series of pulleys were 4 chains, each terminating with a thick leather cuff. Beyond this area stood a structure that reminded Toby of a baseball backstop. Once whitewashed, the 8-foot-high wall of wood was spattered with dark brown stains. Hanging to the left of the panel, their keenly sharpened blades a menacing lot of arches, hooks and spikes and teeth, were a number of farming tools. Although he easily recognized the crescent of the sickle and the prongs of the pitchfork, many of these grotesque instruments were foreign to him. The aged wooden handles were covered with the same dark stains that spattered the walls. Blood, Toby thought as he crouched and examined the floor. Although someone had been careful to spread a thin coat of hay on the earth here, he could still see hints of the glistening, congealing puddles beneath. A pungent metallic odor filled the air, choking Toby with its intensity. Toby knew that Grandma Bell lived off of her farm and that she often butchered animals for food. The only animals worth eating on her farm were cows, and they would be far too large for her to hang in such a fashion. So if it wasn't cows she was butchering, what was this area used for? Toby didn't have long to ponder this new puzzle, as a noise from above startled him out of his thoughts. He watched as a single stalk of straw fluttered silently down to the ground. Something was in the loft. Remaining calm, he peered into the gloom above. Hay, and more hay were all that he could make out. One of the bales probably shifted, he reasoned. Standing up, he made for the entrance. He hadn't taken 2 steps when there was a soft thump. Toby couldn't help but think that it sounded like a footstep. He stared down to the soft glow that infiltrated through the gap in the open door and wondered if a few yards had ever seemed so far. It was all that separated him from the end of this rapidly escalating nightmare. With his heart throbbing in his throat, Toby continued his slow, controlled walk toward the open door of the barn, towards his escape. He moved calmly, deliberately at first. It took all of his willpower not to panic and break into a sprint. If there was something in the loft above, something besides a conjuring of his imagination, then he didn't want to alert it to his presence. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Just above, to the right, something behind the bales kept pace with him. The footfalls were muted, but undeniably present nonetheless. Dust fell from the loft and sprinkled his head. Toby resisted the urge to look up as he quickened his pace. The footsteps above quickened as well. Whatever it was on to him. The time to play it cool had passed. It was time to panic. Using his fear as a jumpstart, Toby broke into a sprint. Above, something shrieked. Hollow and inhuman, its scream echoed throughout the barn, stinging Toby's eardrums with its intensity. Toby didn't need to look up or to listen to know that the thing was chasing him. The cows, sensing the impending horror, were mooing uncontrollably and shifting in their stalls. From behind him came a thud as the thing hit the ground. With the passage to the outside mere feet away, Toby could feel the rush of air as something closed in. It reeked of death and decay. With one final jump, he plunged out into the overcast afternoon, tripped on a rock, and stumbled onto his face. Scrambling to his knees, he was about to scream when he glanced back at the open door. There was nothing there. Toby leapt to his feet, grabbed the giant handle, and pulled the door shut. What was that? He wondered. Bent over with his hands on his knees as he tried to catch his breath, Toby vomited. Sweat soaked his shirt, and he watched as droplets of perspiration fell from his nose and formed dark circles in the dusty earth below him. He did not have long to relax. Beginning at the corner of the barn door and extending toward the back of the house lay a trail of blood. With a leg on each side, Toby followed the path as it snaked this way and that, almost as if the source were drunk or injured. All right, so let's pause there for a moment and go back and go over some of this so that you guys have the correct notes. Now, obviously, things have started to heat up here, but what we want to do is there's some points in the story we want to kind of catch up on and make sure that we're aware of so that we understand what's going to happen next. Now, one thing we want to talk about is when Toby leaves the house, Grandma Bell gives him warnings. She gives him 3 warnings. We want to make sure we have these warnings down in our notes because they're very important. The first warning, of course, is what? That's right. She tells him not to go playing with the cows, says flat out he'll bother the cows. The second warning is what? Well, that would be don't go into the cornfields. And the third warning is stay away from the basement. Now, we have a story that's called Grandma Bell's Basement, so that should be sending off alarm bells because obviously we want to get into that basement and find out what's going on because if the story's named after a basement, it's probably an important detail in the story. So we want to make sure we get down the 3 rules, which is number 1, don't play with the cows. Number 2, stay out of the cornfields. And number 3, don't go in the basement. Now, has Toby already violated one of these rules? Well, yes, he has, because he immediately beelined it right to the barn and started talking to the cows. So whether he wasn't really playing with the cows, but he did go immediately to the barn where the cows were. So right off the bat, Toby has violated these rules. Now, let's get to the barn scene. He gets inside, and he's immediately scared, but he'd rather go investigate the barn than play with his grandmother or spend any time with his grandmother. Now, when he gets to the back of the barn, what he finds is like a big wall of wood, like a baseball backstop, and it's covered with brown stains that we all recognize to be blood. And there are shackles and there are chains. So again, they talks about grandma likes to butchers animals for her own consumption, and they would make all the sense in the world that grandma was butchering cows. However, cows can be several hundred to 1,000 pounds, and for an old skinny woman to pull that cow up on those pulleys would be impossible. So we should be asking ourselves what exactly Grandma Bell does there and how does she do it. So while he's examining this, let's take a moment to talk about the dairy barns. Now, the old dairy barns, there are usually 2 levels. The first level would be the cows, and there's usually probably about 10 feet to 20 feet up would be the hay loft. So when he hears the things above him, usually there's a big distance. I've been in dairy barns before. They're rather tall. So that's probably about 10 to 15 feet off of the ground, if not 20 feet off of the ground, that hay loft that goes around the top of the barn. So picture a second layer. The first layer would be all the stalls. As you walk in, there'd be stalls on either side of you. He goes ahead, and at the end of the barn, the opposite end of the barn, is where he finds that butchering station. And above him would be like a loft that went all the way around the top, and there'd be hay bales stacked all in there. So you're going to have to picture that for what happens next. Now, he finds the stuff on the ground. He finds the blood on the ground, and it looks like it had been covered over with hay. So whatever Grandma Bell was doing there, it happened recently. And he doesn't have long to think about it when that single strand, he hears a little noise and that single strand comes down. So how does the author create suspense when Toby enters the barn? That's on page 97. Let's talk about the fact it starts off with him being all the way in the back of a dark barn, finding blood, finding evidence that something's been butchered, and then having that single piece of grass float down, that single piece of hay, which tells him what? Well, that something is above him, which is creepy enough. So now, one of the things we want to talk about is the character of Toby, and that's going to be an important thing for the test, to talk about how Toby's character is, some of the traits, the fact that he is a round character. One of the things we want to talk about is the fact that Toby is quite bright and quite brave. So does he, when he sees that blade of grass, does he originally or immediately bolt from the barn? Well, hopefully you're shaking your head no, because he does not. He realizes that if he turns around and sprints, whatever's above him is going to recognize that he knows it's there. So his idea is to stay calm as much as he's scared and carefully walk and slowly walk out of the barn so that he doesn't alert whatever's up top that he's onto it. And I think that's a pretty good idea. He's like, all right, something's up there. If I go sprint, it's going to catch me before I get out of here. So what I'm going to do is take my time and make sure that the thing thinks I don't know it's up there and try to get out. Unfortunately, it doesn't pan out that way because as he starts walking, the thing up top does what? Well, it starts walking with him. And then as he finally goes to heck with this, I'm sprinting for it, the thing starts sprinting. And then we have some details about it. Now, one of the things that we ask when we do this story normally is, could this be in Toby's head? And I guess there are signs early on that he could be imagining it. And again, he mentions his imagination as far as the the stuff in the barn goes and says he could be imagining. However, there are a couple things that make it obvious that he's not. Number one are the footsteps above. He hears footsteps keeping pace with him. That's not something he's imagining. Number two, when he runs, the thing shrieks and it sounds inhuman. So we want to keep track of that because we want to figure out what was in the barn. And then when the thing comes after him, it jumps from the top loft, which we've already decided is probably 15 to 20 feet above the ground, and lands on the ground and keeps chasing him. Now, unless it's some kind of parkour master up in the hayloft, most people wouldn't be able to jump 20 feet and keep chasing you. They'd probably break a leg or something. That's a long way to drop. So there are indications that not only is something there, but it may not be human. So he makes it out of the barn, and talk about suspense. That chasing, the suspense would start with the blood, finding the stuff in the back of the barn. That would be number one, I would put for suspense. Number two, we'd talk about the fact that he realizes something's in the barn with him. Number three, it starts chasing him and it sounds inhuman. It gets close enough that he smells its breath and it smells like rot. And then he gets out of the barn. He has a moment where he turns around, expects it to be there. It's gone. He relaxes. But then while he's throwing up on the ground, he notices a trail of blood leading from the barn to the basement. So guess where we're headed now, guys? Now, one of the things he talks about is the trail of blood kind of meanders or kind of goes back and forth like in a wave, almost as if whoever was bleeding was either drunk or severely injured. So let's think about who that might be. We're missing Grandma Bell right now. Could it be Grandma Bell? All right, so please take a moment to fill in some of these details in your notes. Feel free to pause and rewind this as needed to make sure that you have them all, but these are the important things we're going to be talking about at the end of the story, and they're going to be things that are going to be on the test, so you want to make sure you have them in your notes. It didn't take him long to surmise its destination. The trail terminated at the edge of the storm doors, at the opening to the cellar. Stay away from the basement, Grandma Bell had warned. He wasn't about to ignore it. He had no idea what had been in the barn or what had left the trail of blood, but he understood that the discoveries didn't bode well. Toby realized that they were in danger. Grandma Bell, he yelled as he jogged to the front of the house. The door stood wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. Grandma Bell? He asked as he approached the porch. There was no answer. Somewhere in the distance, thunder cracked. The house trembled. Startled, Toby ran inside. There were no lights on in the kitchen. Once innocent and innocuous, the room was rendered macabre by the long strokes of blackness cast by the windows. Festering shadows now obscured entire corners. Lying on the floor before the sink, shattered in 1,000 tiny shards, was a bowl. It wasn't the dish itself that caused his body to tremble and his bladder to ache. Alone, it was just a harmless bowl. It was what the image implied when coupled with Grandma Bell's sudden disappearance and the sinister goings-on at the barn. Grandma, he repeated, weaker this time. Something stirred in the basement below him. He stared at the door that he knew led down into the farmhouse's primitive cellar. Grandma, is that you? He asked again. There was a muffled cry, then nothing but pure corrosive silence. He thought about running, but a thought shot through his brain with the strength of a bullet. What if that's her downstairs? What if whatever was in the barn got Grandma Bell? If he left the house without her, it would be a cowardly act of desertion. Again, more noise from below. Stalking to the cabinets, Toby yanked open drawers until he found the one that he was looking for. This will do, he said as he selected a large butcher knife from the assortment of cutlery. Clutching the handle with sweaty hands, he turned to the basement door. His hands trembled as Toby wrapped his thin fingers around the doorknob and gave it a tentative twist. The lock disengaged with a sharp tick. To Toby, it sounded like a gunshot. Opening the door, he was greeted with a rush of cold, dank air that, for a brief instant, took his breath away. Mingled with the familiar sense of mildew, soil, and grass was another odor, one pungent and metallic. With the knife held out in front to ward off an attack, Toby stepped into the alcove and began his descent. Immediately, he felt his arms erupt into goosebumps as the chilly air caressed his tacky flesh. The thick wood of the ancient stairs groaned with each step. Below, an eerie yellow glow, much like the luminance shed by an open flame, provided enough flickering light for him to see by. Reaching the packed dirt floor, he rounded the end of the staircase and peered into the basement. Although the farmhouse was by no means small, the basement seemed to extend much further than the building it supported. Standing at one end, Toby found it impossible to see to the other. Instead of wood beams, thick stone pillars supported the floor above. Set at 10-foot intervals, the pillars were joined at the top by ornate arches that reminded Toby of those in the old Gothic church he had once visited in the city. To his left, a small staircase ascended toward the storm doors. To the right stood a series of 4 dense wooden doors reinforced by thick tarnished metal strips. Where these doors led, Toby hadn't a clue. There was a room in the far corner, and its prison-like iron door stood slightly ajar. It was from this room that the light trickled, and it's toward this room that Toby crept. He thought about calling his grandmother's name again, but quickly abandoned the idea. Regardless of what might be in the room, he didn't want to alert it to his presence. A rustling sound emanated from the chamber, like the whisper of shaken hay. Another noise, soft and wispy, underlined the rustle. The moist, breathy whisper of air escaping. His breath constricted in his lungs by dread's frozen grip, Toby leaned forward and slipped his face into the crack. All right, so this seems to be a good place to stop, to leave it at a nice cliffhanger. Let's pause for a moment and do some of these questions and notes in the margin. Remember, we want to get all of these down. So if you can't print out the story and write on the story, which is completely understandable, what you do want to do is make sure you put these in a Google document that you can share with me. So on page 99, what does Toby discover outside of the barn? Well, that should be fairly obvious. There is a trail of blood leading to the basement. Now, one of the things we want to talk about again is the weather, so we want to pay attention that the weather, when he gets toward the house, the thunder actually cracks and it gets very, very dark. So the weather has gone from just a storm in the distance when he first drives up to the storm a little bit closer to when he goes outside. Imagine that scene where he goes outside for the first time where grandma yells the warning to him. He's all excited. This would be the part in a horror movie where they'd be like all chipper music, happy music, and he'd be outside he grabs a piece of hay, puts it in his lips. He's like, I'm free. But in the background, the author makes a point of saying that the storm clouds have darkened. So although it seems like a fun moment for Toby, if the reader's paying attention, the weather is telling us that what's going to happen is not good. So after he gets out of the barn, he goes to the house, and he is starting to worry now that Grandma Bell is missing. He's found the blood in the back of the barn. He can't find Grandma Bell, and he's panicking. So, and then once again, as he gets in the house, the thunder strikes. So that storm has gotten even closer. So as things get scarier in the story, the weather does what? Hint, hint. So why doesn't Toby flee the farm and leave Grandma Bell? You have a lot of kids when we're reading the story go, man, I'd be out of there. I don't even know the woman. I don't like her. I just run. And I get it. But I think in Toby's case, he feels like he would be a coward. That's the important part. He feels it would be incredibly cowardly for him to run and leave his grandmother there, whether he has a good relationship or not. Now, how does the author create suspense when Tony gets to the kitchen? Should be to, not tot. Anyway, what happens is he gets in the kitchen. What has happened? Originally, it's just this old, bright, dirty kitchen. When he comes in, the lights are off. It's dark. There's shadows everywhere. There is some great imagery there when he walks in, talking about the strokes of blackness cast by windows, festering shadows now obscured entire corners. Those would all be examples of imagery that you'd want to get from the story. The other thing is when he comes in, he finds a bowl shattered on the floor. Now, if I'm sitting there with my wife and my kids and there's a bowl shattered on the floor, it's pretty obvious somebody accidentally broke a bowl, no big deal. What makes it creepy is Grandma Bell is missing. The room is dark and there's a broken bowl, which indicates that something bad happened to her, that she was grabbed or whatever. So that's why he focuses on that bowl. That's why the bowl is important. So then he's standing there wondering what happened to Grandma Bell. He can't find her. And then he hears what? A muffled cry or something from the basement. So now we have that again. She told him not to go in the basement. You guess where Toby's going to go, because that's what has to happen for any horror story. They always end up going to places they're not supposed to. And in this case, I think if we're talking about the character of Toby and we talk about how we would describe him, brave would be one, because any other kid would be like, the heck with this, I'm out, and would be running up the driveway trying to escape. Toby goes, grabs a knife, and decides to go down and investigate, which I think makes him a very likable character, because he's not just going to leave his grandmother there. He's going to go try to fight. Now, he gets into the basement, and there should be some clues that something is not quite right in the basement. Number one, when you have a basement, it's usually the same size as your house. So, for example, if my house is 40 feet by 20 feet, my basement will likely be 40 feet by 20 feet. When Toby gets in the basement, what is the first indication that something is not quite right? As my dog snores in the background. That's right. It's the fact that the basement seems to go on well past where the house is. That's not normal. That's something kind of weird. And normally you won't have a basement anywhere that's bigger than the actual building it's supporting. What is the second thing that's weird about the basement? Well, that would be those columns. If you go to a church and they have the stone columns, and usually I would draw this one on the board, but it has columns that go, instead most basements would have wooden posts. That would be normal, metal posts. They don't have ornate or really fancy stone columns like you would find in a Gothic church. And again, if you want to see what a Gothic church looks like, look up Gothic church. It'll give you an idea what he's looking at. Another thing he finds in the basement is the fact that there are doors, metal, huge, thick wooden doors with metal ribbons on them, holding them together, metal supports. That's kind of odd. It almost looks like a dungeon down there. So he's there. He hears some noises. He hears something that sounds like hay being shaken around and like air escaping. And he's thinking Grandma is in some trouble. So with the knife in hand, he creeps over to this open door. And now we're going to find out, well, we're kind of going to get an idea what's going on and how much trouble Toby is really in. Grandma Bell stood inside, and she was alive and well, but her reappearance did nothing to alleviate his fear. He felt his terror escalate, at once plunging him into depths of fear which he had never experienced, even in his foulest nightmares. She stood, stooped over a thick wood bench, her long fingers, like legs of a spider crab, toiling feverishly over her fiendish project. She still wore her apron, but it was no longer the quasi-clean shade of gray. Instead, it glistened with a liberal coating of blood. Tiny droplets of gore covered her wrinkled brow as well, and crimson stippled her arms. The naked body of a man lay on the bench. He had been opened, gullet to groin, and his torso was being held gaping by a metal claw-like contraption. Although the poor man's insides had clearly been removed, he wasn't quite empty. His body had been stuffed full of straw. Using a dagger-sized needle threaded with long strips of rawhide, Grandma Bell sewed him back up. She whistled Camptown races as she labored. Toby received the second shock as the corpse's bloodshot eyes popped open and locked on Toby's own. Like a fish struggling for air, the cadaver's mouth gaped as he tried to speak. The sound released was like air leaking from a tire. Toby screamed. The knife tumbled from his grip. Grandma Bell wheeled, her skeletal face a gnarled twist of rage. "You!" she shrieked. "I told you to stay away from the basement!" Dropping the needle, she snatched a long, slender knife from a hook on the wall. Toby didn't wait to discover her intentions. Summoning the last of his nerve, he turned and fled back through the cellar. He could hear Grandma right behind him. Despite her age, she moved swiftly. As Toby sprinted to the storm doors, the thought occurred to him that they might be locked, leaving him trapped in the short alcove. He didn't have long to worry, however, as his hands crashed into the dry wood, throwing the doors open. Ignoring the slivers jutting from his palms, Toby sprinted around the house and plunged into the cornfield. He wheezed as the thick, suffocating summer air choked his lungs. If not for the burst of adrenaline, Toby would have been hard-pressed to make his escape. The oppressive late-afternoon heat would have ensnared him like a net. The massive thunderclouds were now directly above the farm, and the property was cast in artificial twilight. To the east, a lightning bolt cleaved the sky in two, bathing the countryside in flashbulb-like light. Chancing a glance behind him, he realized that Grandma Bell was nowhere in sight. With his head turned, Toby never saw the post. He crashed into it, knocking the breath from his lungs. Landing hard on the dirt, momentarily stunned, he lifted his head to see what he had hit. All right, so let's pause here for a second and go through some of these because obviously we have a lot to digest. First off, Toby opens the door. He doesn't find Grandma Bell in danger. Nope, not at all. What does he find? Well, he finds Grandma Bell working at stuffing a guy. She's got the guy on the table. He's opened up. All of his insides have been removed. Kind of gnarly, and this would be one of our horror elements, obviously. And she has filled him with straw and is sewing him back up, which that would be horrific enough. Grandma Bell is obviously some type of twisted murderer. Now we have an idea of what was going on and what was being butchered in the barn and why there was blood over to the basement. She had probably dragged him in. However, things get weirder and they turn supernatural when what happens? That's right. When the body turns, looks at him, its eyes open, its mouth opens, it's gasping for air, which it should not be able to do because, well, it's definitely dead. It shouldn't be, the person on that table should not be making any noise or moving its eyes. So now we have introduced a supernatural element. What we need to ask ourselves is, what is Grandma Bell doing exactly? Why is she stuffing these people? And what is going on in this farm? That should be the question, the big question guiding us as we go forward. So that should be written down in your notes. What is happening on Grandma Bell's farm? So on page 101, we have what is wrong with the basement. We've already filled that in. The section of lines afterwards, we should be talking about what he discovers with Grandma Bell when he opens those doors. Now, moving on. How does the author use imagery in the basement scene to create horror? We just went over that. It's the description of what Grandma Bell is doing to the corpse. That is horrific. Toby realizes I'm in trouble, accidentally drops a knife. Grandma Bell does not sound like she's pleased because she says, I told you not to go in the basement, screams it at him, grabs a knife, and starts chasing. And we have another sign that Grandma Bell might not be the normal old grandma type because she's able to keep up with him. She's very fast for an old woman. He ends up breaking through the cellar doors, goes into the cornfield, and runs into something. Now, in the beginning of the story, we talked about the fact that there was these little, actually, I didn't go into it in the notes part, but if you remember when he's driving up, he notices there's all these posts standing out of the corn. He doesn't know what they are. There are a lot of them, several dozen, and he's like, I'll have to figure that out later. Well, he has just run into one of these posts. So he's in the field, he's been knocked on his keister, and now we have to figure out what exactly is going on in the barn and on the farm. One more thing, when he breaks out of the basement, we've been watching the weather the entire time. Obviously, the thunderstorm is now directly above the farm. So the weather has gotten even worse as things in the story have gotten worse. So with that, let's get back into the story. Crucified several feet above the ground hung a scarecrow. As Toby's vision cleared, it became apparent that it was unlike any scarecrow he had ever seen. Although the figure wore the traditional garb, dry-rotted dungarees, a ragged flannel shirt, dry-rotted boots, and a straw cap, the dummy's visage was far from ordinary. No burlap bag concealed a rag-stuffed face. Lolling from the masticated neck was a rotted human head, its semi-exposed skull covered with brownish strips of dried, sinewy muscle and knotted clumps of hair. Its lips had either curled back with rot or been picked off by birds, and it bared its yellow teeth in a sardonic grin. Tufts of straw jutted from between the buttons of his shirt, and it looked as if some were stained with blood. Toby thought about the corpse in the basement and immediately understood. Thunder clapped, the wind howled, and above it all, rising with an intensity that penetrated the very soul and rattled the bones, was Grandma Bell's cackling howl. Standing up, Toby could see the house just above the corn. She stood in the attic window, her arms outstretched, her face grotesquely contorted in a maniacal grimace. I told you to stay out of the cellar! Her voice was filled with godlike potency and seemed to rumble from the very heavens. Awaken, my children! Awaken! Behind him, the ghastly scarecrow tore its hands free from the arms of the cross. As it clawed at the ropes around its waist, it screamed. It was the same inhuman, unholy sound Toby had heard in the barn. Fear pumped through his veins like jet fuel as Toby sprinted deeper into the field. As he fled, the corn stalks, with their tentacle-like branches, stabbed at his face and slapped his body like hundreds of switches. Whack, 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 delivering a barrage of whippings for his transgressions as he passed. The plants taunted him cruelly. She told you not to go down there, they scolded. Don't go in the basement, she said. Plowing blindly through the stalks, his hands and face absorbing the stinging blows, he cried, I'm sorry, in rapid succession, knowing that his words were lost in the constant whooshing created by his passage and by the whispering of the stalks that had risen to the volume of a bee swarm. Many times he stumbled, once he fell, but he continued to drive, his feet pushing into the soft earth even as the upper half of his body struggled to catch up. Immediately to his left, something tore through the cornstalks, bending them over as it pursued. How did it catch up with me already? He wondered as he picked up his pace. He had precious little time to ponder the question as he realized it was also something keeping pace with him on the right. Passing through a small circular clearing, his eyes bulged as he dodged another cross. Another empty cross. Toby remembered the posts he had seen when driving up to the farm. If each one of those posts was a cross, and each cross carried a scarecrow, Toby realized that he hadn't imagined the deafening buzz rising from the cornfield. It was the collective rustle of over 24 or more scarecrows as they tore through the corn rows in an effort to join the hunt. All right, so let's pause here because this is another wonderful cliffhanger. Toby is in a lot of trouble. So let's talk about what happens here. He gets into the cornfield and he realizes right away that he has struck the post. He looks up and what is there? A scarecrow, and it's not a normal scarecrow. What are the problems with the scarecrow? And this is another spot where we have horrific imagery where he talks about, although the figure that wore traditional garb, dry rotted, that would be on page 103, that middle paragraph is all imagery. The scarecrow isn't just a normal rag-filled scarecrow. It's a human being that has been turned into a scarecrow. So now we have an idea of two things. Number one, we know what Grandma Bell was probably doing in the basement. She was making another one of her 6 scarecrows. However, we have another realization here. When Toby drives up, we talk about the fact that he sees all those posts. All of those dozens of posts all contain what? That's right, scarecrows. There are dozens of scarecrows, zombie scarecrows in that field, which is not a good thing because Grandma Bell, before he has long to think about the scarecrow situation, comes out of the attic and screams, "Arise, awaken my children, awaken," and calls these scarecrows to life. And the scarecrow nearest to Toby starts to wake up and come after him. So now we realize she's got an army of reanimated scarecrow zombie things, and they're going to be chasing Toby. Now, Toby doesn't realize the army part here. And what happens is, what realization does Toby make? The realization he makes during falling action on page 104 is he realizes that there isn't just one of these things chasing him, that Grandma Bell has made an army of them and the cornfield is full of them. And how does the author build up the suspense in this scene? Well, Toby is running from what he thinks is one zombie. That's the important part. When he starts off, he's like, I'm getting away from the zombie. And he starts hearing this whooshing. And he thinks it's, if you've ever run through the woods, you can hear the whoosh as the plants go by. And then he hears a buzzing that almost sounds like a beehive. Well, he realizes afterwards the buzzing is actually not in his head. It's all of the scarecrows coming to get him. And there is a scene where one of them is caught up to him on his left, and he's like, how did it catch up to me already? And then he realizes there's something else on his right. And that's the moment where it's super suspenseful because we have this young boy running through a cornfield being chased by not just one zombie scarecrow, but possibly dozens of zombie scarecrows. So obviously things have gone very, very badly for Toby. He's in a very rough spot. So now we will go to the conclusion of the story and figure out if Toby is going to escape or not, and whether or not Grandma Bell is going to get her grandson. Jogging left, Toby just avoided one of the monsters as it leapt at him like a hungry jungle cat. This one was fresher than the others, and Toby could almost smell the rotted flesh that covered its bare, crudely stitched chest. Its eyeballs, round and blue, bulged from its mangled face. Cutting a diagonal line through the field, he stumbled onto the dirt driveway. Around him, the undead tore apart the cornfield, and the ground trembled with their footsteps. Ahead lay the road and his possible salvation. Infused with hope, he pushed his young body to the limits as he sprinted to the narrow lane. He was only a few yards from salvation. The scarecrows howled in chorus. To Toby, it was the most frightening yet wonderful sound he had ever heard, for it wasn't in anger that they sounded off, but in frustration. Stepping into the street, Toby was immediately blinded by light. Putting his hands above his face, he stumbled and fell. The truck, its brakes squealing like a stuck pig, slid to a stop just inches away. "What do you think you're doing, boy?" a man called from the driver's seat. Without hesitation, Toby ran to the passenger door, pulled it open, and climbed in. "Please," he managed between heavy breaths. "You have to get me out of here. Something's chasing me." He felt faint now. His face was a throbbing red pucker, and bile was creeping up the back of his throat. The heat had definitely taken its toll. Slouching low in the seat, staring out of the window, he expected to see the scarecrows rush from the fields. "Now, you just hold on a minute. What's chasing you?" the man asked. His voice was deep, yet hollow. "It was scarecrows," Toby screamed as he turned to face the driver. Although most of his huge frame was obscured by shadow, the man's arm was visible. With his gloved hand resting on the stick shift, the badly decayed appendage was just visible in the dying daylight. It wasn't only the sight of the rotted tissue that caused Toby to whimper. It was the star-shaped tattoo on the gray flesh. "Scarecrows?" he asked. "Oh, they're harmless." Shifting the truck into gear, the man floored the accelerator. The truck shot back up Grandma Bell's driveway. Outside, thunder clapped. Then the skies opened up. The only thing louder than Toby's hysterical screams was Grandpa's insane laughter. All right, so how many people guessed what was going on here? Toby manages to escape the cornfield. He thinks he is safe, and then we have situational irony because we think he's escaped. The truck almost hits him. He gets in the truck, and who is driving the truck but Grandpa? So Grandpa is, yes, one of the zombie scarecrow people. Now, there's many interpretations of the story. The first one is that Grandma Bell is obviously some type of witch or necromancer. A necromancer is kind of like a witch, somebody that uses black magic to raise people from the dead. Now, we ask, how has Grandma Bell run her farm this whole time? Well, who is she using as workers on the farm? It's not migrant workers, or maybe they start off as migrant workers, but most likely what is happening is she's attracting people there to work on her farm. She's killing them, turning them into zombie scarecrows, and the scarecrows do all the work. So that is her farm crew that you're seeing. So in case people missed that part. So Toby seemingly escapes, but only to hop in the car with Grandpa, and now they're headed back toward the farm. So unfortunately, we don't know what happens to Toby after this point. That's something we will, talk about in the future, or something you guys will talk about, because one of your assignments is going to be to tell me what happens to Toby, and I've had some really good ideas come out of students over the years. But what did you think of the story? Personally, I like this one because I think it builds slowly, but when things start happening, a lot of things start happening. And I think there are a lot of clues as we go through that something is not quite right. Now, as far as the weather, when we're tracking the weather, it starts off super hot and oppressive. He says his t-shirt is sticking to him like a blistered layer of skin, but there's some storm clouds in the distance. And then as the story proceeds to get worse and worse and worse for Toby, the storm gets closer and closer and closer and stronger. And then what finally happens, Toby gets captured by his grandfather. He's on his way back to the farm. We don't know what they plan to do with him. And what happens to the storm? Well, the skies open up. It starts pouring. So that's the end of the story. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that one. Now what we're going to do is go on and finish. So you want to finish your notes. How does Toby escape? He makes it to the main street. He thinks he's safe. But unfortunately, he doesn't escape because he gets into car with Grandpa before he realizes that Grandpa's there. And how do we know it's Grandpa, by the way? Well, the clue was given in that photograph in Grandma Bell's kitchen where Grandpa has the star tattoo on his arm. The scarecrow zombie monster thing driving the car has the star tattoo on its arm as well. So we don't know what becomes of Toby, unfortunately, but we will figure that out. So anyway, let's move on to the questions. And again, we should be doing all of these on Google Drive. Basically, you can go through right on Google Drive and type them out. All right, so now let's go over the questions for Grandma Bell's Basement and try to figure out what we read. So using your text and split page notes as a reference, answer the following questions. Be sure to use complete sentences and to cite the text when appropriate. So do your best on this one, guys. I know it's not ideal because I'm not walking around helping with it, but give it your best shot. So number one, what is the setting of the story? How does the author describe the setting? Write examples below. For this, you do not need direct quotes from the story, but what I want are examples of the weather, the temperature, where it takes place. Are we in a city or are we someplace different? And maybe some of the major set pieces, meaning places like the barn, the cornfield, and the basement. Talk a little bit about that. Number two, who are the characters in this story? What do we know about them? How are they described? Now, Mom and Dad don't really have a very big part in this. Mom is your typical doting mom. Dad just seems like a jerk. But obviously, we're going to concentrate on Grandma Bell here and Toby. So what do we know about each? How old is Grandma Bell? How old is Toby? What are the physical characteristics of Grandma Bell? And now that we finished the story, what do we learn about Grandma Bell? What is she probably? Number three, what does Toby notice in the fields as they are driving up to Grandma Bell's farms? I'll give you a hint. We find out what they are and what's hanging off of them at the end. Number four, what is the main conflict of this story when it first begins? How does this conflict evolve and change as the story progresses? This is a tricky one because as we begins, the conflict is literally the fact that Toby has to spend time with his grandmother, and it's incredibly awkward because he doesn't know her. That's how it starts off. However, as the story goes on, we have a bigger conflict in which we find out Grandma is probably some type of witch or necromancer, and he has seen too much and she has sent killer scarecrows after him. So we kind of have two different conflicts there. So make sure you are able to talk about how it starts off, Toby and the grandmother, how it ends. It still involves Toby and the grandmother, but the actual friction between them is different. It's no longer awkwardness. It sounds like Grandma's trying to kill him. All right, number 5, in the story, Toby is left with a relative who he doesn't know well and isn't comfortable with. Has this ever happened to you? Explain. Now, this is a personal story, but the majority of us have been in a situation like this, so try to think of a time where you were with a relative that you weren't very comfortable with and how it could be, extra awkward because of that. Number 6, who is the man in the photo? What do we learn about him? How is he described? Again, that's going to be that scene in the kitchen. What type of guy was he? What does Grandma Bell say about him? And you can even go so far to talk about that although he was probably killed, it sounds like it was probably cancer that he got. Grandma Bell was able to bring him back. Grandma Bell was able to bring him back, and we have him at the end of the story. So talk a bit about that. Number 7, what does Toby ask to do? What is Grandma Bell's response? What are her 3 warnings? I'm not going to give you any clues on this one because you should have these clearly in your notes. Number 8, what feeling does Toby get when he enters the barn? What do you think the author is trying to hint to? The author is trying to hint toward this is building suspense. Toby is recognizing something's wrong with the barn. He is scared right off the bat, and the author is trying to give us a heads up that something is about to go very wrong. What does the author do after Toby leaves the house to change the mood of the story? Toby leaves the house for a minute. The mood kind of gets bright because Toby's in a good mood. But remember, we have the storm clouds in the background that Toby doesn't seem to notice. So it changes on the surface. The author seems to make it like the mood's going to be happy, but he's giving us a clue that nope, things are about to get scary. The author uses personification when Toby opens the barn. Write the quote here. I'll give you a hint. It's about the barn breathing. Get that quote. Number 11, what feeling does Toby get upon entering the barn? What literary device is the author using? I'll give you a hint. It's foreshadowing. Just think about how Toby is feeling the minute he comes to the barn. He immediately gets a hunch that something's wrong, so talk about that. Number 12, what does Toby find at the back of the barn? Well, that's going to be the big wooden backstop-like thing with the shackles and chains and all the bloody tools. How does the author create and heighten the level of suspense during the barn scene? I'll give you a hint. Toby tries to do what? How does he try to walk out of the barn? What happens in the loft above him? Talk about that scene, how it starts off, he's calm, and then it's not so calm. What happens in that scene? Number 14, we can't really do because we finished the story already. Prediction, what do you think was in the barn? But if you can remember what you thought was in the barn when we first read the story, feel free to put it here. Number 15, how are we sure that there was something in the barn and it wasn't just Toby's imagination? Again, let's talk about the fact that we had that single piece of straw, we had the sound of the footsteps, we had the thing screaming, and we had it hit the ground behind him and get so close that he could smell its breath. All indications that Toby was not imagining anything, it was actually there. So those would be the 4 things I would concentrate on. What does Toby discover after escaping the barn? Where does it lead? Think about when he's looking at the ground. You guys should know this one. What does Toby find when he enters the kitchen? What does he think happened? Well, it involves a bowl. It involves Grandma Bell being missing, and it involves him thinking something bad happened to Grandma Bell. Those are my clues for that one. Number 18. Why does Toby decide to enter the basement? What does he think he would, well, bottom line, what does he think he would be if he leaves Grandma Bell down there? At that point, he thinks Grandma Bell's in trouble in the basement, and he thinks he would be something if he were to leave her there. Number 19, would you go down into the basement? What would you do in this situation? Tell me, what would you, I think when you read a story like this, we all think about what we would do in those situations. I often joke when we read stories that I'd be out of there, but I don't know if I'd be able to leave my grandmother in the basement thinking she was in trouble. Number 20, how does the author use imagery once Toby begins his descent into the cellar? Give 3 examples. Think about the shadows dancing. Think about describing the pillars that are holding the place up. There's a lot of imagery in that scene. So pull out some things that the author describes to really allow us to picture what Toby is seeing. Number 21, what is not quite right about the basement? Give 2 examples. Again, you should have 3 examples in your notes. Choose 2 of them. Number 22, what does Toby discover when he looks in the basement room? What kind of irony is this and why? Well, I'll just tell you flat out, we're looking at situational irony because at this point we think Grandma Belle is, when he opens that door, he hears something in there. We're expecting Grandma Belle is going to be the one in trouble, but when he peeks in, he finds out, nope, Grandma Belle's not in trouble. She's the one actually doing the killing. So we have situational irony when he realizes his grandmother's not only not in trouble, but she is the person he should be afraid of. Number 23, what happens in the story that lets the reader know that this is a supernatural tale? I'll give you a hint. It involves that body that she's sewing up. Number 24, what is Grandma Belle's reaction when she discovers Toby watching her? She wants a big hug. No, I'm just kidding. That has nothing to do with hugs. She does not want to hug him, but what happens? Is she happy? Is she mad? Is she upset? Explain. Number 25, how does Toby escape the basement? The storm doors are the ones that almost look like a triangle. You might have them in the back of your yard. You open the doors up and then you walk down a staircase into the basement. So in case you didn't understand what storm doors were, they're usually wooden and you see them in a lot of older movies that lead from the outside into the basement. So he breaks through the storm doors. Number 26, where does Toby run after escaping? Well, that's pretty obvious. It's also one of her warnings. So Toby literally goes through all 3 of her warnings in the story and does the exact opposite, although we can't really blame him at this point. Number 27, what horrific discovery does Toby make after running into the pole in the cornfield? Well, I'll give you a hint. It involves all those posts. Number 28, what is wrong with the scarecrow he discovers? Well, it's not made of sacks or rags or just straw, so I'll leave it to you guys to come up with the answer for that. Number 29, in the beginning of the story, Toby notices posts in the cornfield. What do we now know about them? What's on each one of those posts, guys? Number 30, as Toby is fleeing through the cornfield, he makes another horrifying discovery. What is it? Well, I'll give you a hint. How many of these things are chasing him now? Number 24, who picks Toby up at the end of the story? How do we know? What kind of irony is this? We just covered that when we went over the end of the story. Who is it and why is it irony? What type of irony is it? Well, we're not expecting that person to be driving the truck. So now, this one here, I want you guys to have fun with. I don't want you to stress over it, but I would like you guys to try to all give it a try. In the very least, I'd like a paragraph, but if you think you can do more, please, by all means, do more. To finish this one up, on page 112, we have Grandma Belle's basement. What happens next? A lot of people will talk about the fact that although we have a resolution to Toby's story wherein he ends up in Grandpa Belle's truck heading back to the farm, we don't know what happens to him once he gets back there. So the story Grandma Belle's basement has an open resolution. That means although we've solved some of the story's conflict, there are still questions that remain unanswered, like what happened to Toby after the story ended. By yourself or with a partner, obviously it's going to be by yourself unless you guys are palling around after school, write a final act of the story that explains what happened to our protagonist after the story ends. What happens to Toby once he gets back to the house? Do his parents come back for him? What happens when they arrive? So again, guys, have fun with it. Come up with an idea. If you want to do a summary of what your story would be, so in other words, instead of writing a whole story, I think this is what happens, feel free. I want it to be at least 5 sentences, though. So please don't go, I think Toby dies, or I think Toby escapes. Explain. Give me some examples, and give this one a good try, because I think this is one, if you let your imaginations go a little bit, you could have some fun with.